The bullet shattered the lantern glass before Eleanor even heard the shot. In the sudden darkness of the Wyoming ranch house, she pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, her wedding ring, worn for less than a month, catching the moonlight as her hand trembled. Outside, a man's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Come on out, bargain bride. Let's see what Warren paid for." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Caleb was supposed to be 2 days away. She was alone. And the man circling the house knew exactly what the town had called her, knew exactly how to make it hurt. If you want to know how a woman dismissed as worthless became priceless, stay until the end. Like this video and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop with a screech of brakes and a hiss of steam that seemed to carry Eleanor Hayes's last breath of courage away with it. Through the smudged window, she could see the wooden platform of Bear Creek Station, if it could even be called that. A handful of weathered boards, a crooked sign, and a scattering of people who had clearly come not to welcome travelers, but to witness an arrival they'd already decided was worth gossiping about. Eleanor's reflection stared back at her from the glass. 23 years old, with dark hair pulled severely back, gray eyes that tried to hide fear behind determination, and a dress that had once been fashionable in Philadelphia, but now looked merely tired after 3 days of travel. Her hands were folded in her lap, clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She made herself release them, smoothing the wrinkled fabric of her skirt as if that small act could restore some dignity to this moment. "Bear Creek Station," the conductor called, his voice carrying the particular disinterest of a man who had made this announcement 1,000 times before. 15-minute stop." Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady after so many hours of sitting. She reached for her carpet bag, the only luggage she had brought, containing everything she now owned in the world, and made her way down the narrow aisle. The few other passengers in her car studiously avoided looking at her. They had all heard, of course. Gossip traveled faster than any locomotive, and the story of the mail-order bride heading to Wyoming had circulated through the train like wildfire. The conductor helped her down the steps with mechanical courtesy. "Good luck, miss," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested she would need it. The moment her feet touched the platform, Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in Bear Creek Station settle on her like a physical thing. There were perhaps 20 people scattered about, ranchers waiting for supplies, a few women with shopping baskets, children who had come to see the train. All of them were staring. "That's her," someone whispered, not even trying to keep their voice down. "The mail-order bride." "Heard Warren sent for her from back east," another voice added. "Paid for the ticket himself." "Probably the only way a man like him could get a wife," a third person said with a mean little laugh. "Living all alone out there, strange and quiet as he is." Eleanor kept her chin up, her gaze straight ahead, even as heat flooded her cheeks. She had known this would be difficult. She had prepared herself for judgment and gossip. But somehow, the reality of it, the casual cruelty, the way these strangers felt entitled to discuss her circumstances as if she were livestock being assessed at auction, was worse than she had imagined. "Which one do you suppose is Warren?" a woman's voice asked. "That one, I'd wager. Standing by the post. Looks about as friendly as a rattlesnake." Eleanor followed the direction of the woman's gaze and found him immediately. He stood apart from the others, leaning against a wooden post at the far end of the platform with his arms crossed over his chest. Tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his worn work shirt, dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains rising in the distance. He wasn't looking at her yet, but at the crowd, and there was something in his expression, a controlled hardness, a banked anger that made her breath catch. That was Caleb Warren, her husband-to-be, the man who had, if the gossips were to be believed, purchased her for the price of a train ticket. "Look at him glaring at everyone," someone muttered, "as if he's got any right to judge, buying himself a wife like she's a head of cattle." Eleanor's hands tightened on her carpet bag. She wanted to scream at them, to explain that she was not cattle, that circumstances beyond her control had brought her here, that her father's gambling debts and death had left her with choices that weren't really choices at all. But she had learned long ago that explaining yourself to people who had already decided what you were worth was a waste of breath. So instead, she lifted her chin higher and began walking toward Caleb Warren. The crowd's whispers followed her like flies. Brave of her, I'll give her that. Desperate, more like. Wonder what he paid for her. Can't have been much. Heard she comes from nothing. Father died owing money all over Philadelphia. Well, she's Wyoming's problem now. Each word landed like a small stone, and Eleanor felt herself building a wall around her heart, brick by brick, to keep the pain out. She had done this before back in Philadelphia when the collectors came and the society ladies who had once welcomed her mother turned their backs. She knew how to endure public shame. She just hadn't expected to have to do it again quite so soon. When she was close enough, Caleb Warren's gaze finally shifted to her. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the shadow of his hat, and they studied her with an intensity that made her feel both seen and assessed. But there was no cruelty in that gaze, no mockery. If anything, there was something like understanding, and perhaps a recognition of shared humiliation. He pushed away from the post and straightened to his full height. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared from across the platform. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that looked like it could take a punch. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were scarred and calloused. Working hands, capable hands. Eleanor Hayes? His voice was deep and quiet, meant only for her ears. Yes. Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. Mr. Warren? Caleb. He glanced past her at the watching crowd, and something dark flickered across his face. We should go. No point giving them more to talk about than they already have. I imagine they'll talk regardless, Eleanor said before she could stop herself. His eyes returned to her, and for just a moment something that might have been respect showed in them. That they will. But they can do it without us standing here like a circus show. He reached for her carpet bag, and Eleanor almost pulled it away, an instinctive reaction to a stranger taking her belongings. But then she remembered that this man was not a stranger, not really. In a matter of days, he would be her husband. She forced herself to release the bag. Thank you, she said quietly. Caleb nodded once, then turned toward a wagon hitched at the far end of the platform. Eleanor followed, acutely aware that every eye was still on them, every ear straining to catch any word that might be worth repeating later. Doesn't look like much, does she? Someone said, not quite quietly enough. What did he expect for the price of a train ticket? Someone else answered with a laugh. Eleanor's steps faltered. She couldn't help it. The casual dismissal of her worth, reduced to the cost of transportation, struck something deep and painful. She was so tired of being measured and found wanting by her father's creditors, by Philadelphia society, by the minister who had looked at her with pity when she came asking about positions as a governess, by the woman at the agency who had suggested practical marriage with the enthusiasm of someone selling dubious produce at market. A hand touched her elbow, gentle but firm enough to steady her. Caleb Warren had stopped and turned back, and now stood close enough that the watching crowd couldn't see his face clearly. Don't let them see it hurt, he said, his voice low and surprisingly kind. That's what they want. That's what they came for. Eleanor looked up at him, this stranger who in a few days would have the legal right to control every aspect of her life, and found something unexpected in his expression. Solidarity. He understood. Of course he did. They had mocked him too, the strange, quiet rancher who couldn't find a wife the normal way, who had to send back east for one. I'm trying, she whispered. I know. He released her elbow and continued toward the wagon, but he adjusted his pace so she could keep up easily. Just a little further. The wagon was sturdy but plain, hitched to two horses that looked well cared for despite their work-worn appearance. Caleb placed her carpet bag in the back with more care than she expected, then turned to help her up onto the seat. His hands at her waist were brief and respectful, steadying her until she was settled, then releasing immediately. He climbed up beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon lurched into motion, and Bear Creek Station, with its judgmental eyes and cruel whispers, began to recede behind them. Eleanor stared straight ahead, refusing to look back. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the plod of the horses' hooves, and the wind whispering through the tall grass that stretched endlessly in every direction. The sky was impossibly big here, so much larger than the sky between Philadelphia's buildings, and the mountains in the distance looked like they belonged to another world entirely. It was beautiful, in a harsh, unforgiving way. Eleanor thought it matched this situation perfectly. "I need to say something," Caleb finally spoke, his eyes still on the road ahead. "And I need you to hear it clearly." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. Here it came, the list of expectations, the rules she would be required to follow, the shape her new life would take whether she wanted it or not. "The money I paid," Caleb continued, "was for your travel, nothing more. You understand?" Eleanor blinked, not certain she had heard correctly. What?" "The train ticket, the arrangements through the agency, the meals on your journey. That's what I paid for, the cost of getting you here safely." He turned to look at her then, his expression serious and intent. "I did not buy you. I did not purchase a wife. That's not what this is, regardless of what those people back there think they know." Eleanor stared at him, her heart doing something complicated in her chest, a confused mixture of relief and suspicion. In her experience, men who made such declarations often meant something else entirely. "Then what is this?" she asked carefully. Caleb returned his attention to the road, but she could see the tension in his jaw, as if he were choosing his words with great care. "This is two people who need something from each other, trying to find a way to make it work that preserves both their dignities. I need help running a ranch that's too much for one person. I need someone who can handle the house and the accounts and wouldn't mind learning the land. You need—" He paused, then continued gently. "You need safety and security and a place where your past doesn't define your future." "How do you know about my past?" Eleanor asked, and she couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "The agency told me the basics. Your father passed, left debts, left you with no protection and no prospects." He glanced at her again. "I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry that circumstances forced you to this choice." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "It wasn't much of a choice." "No," Caleb agreed quietly. "I don't imagine it was. Same as it wasn't much of a choice for me. A man alone out here has a hard time of it. People assume things. They don't trust you the same way. And when it comes to needing help or doing business, doors close that ought to stay open. So you need a wife for respectability?" "Partly. Also because I genuinely do need help with the ranch. And because—" He hesitated, and Eleanor thought she saw color rise in his weathered cheeks. "Because I wouldn't mind having someone to talk to at the end of a long day. Someone who might understand that silence isn't the same as having nothing to say." There was something achingly lonely in that statement, and Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. She had been so focused on her own desperate circumstances that she hadn't considered that Caleb Warren might be desperate too, in his own way. "What are you offering exactly?" she asked, needing to understand the parameters of this arrangement before she let herself hope for anything resembling kindness. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a promise. "I'm offering you a partnership. We'll marry, yes, that's necessary for both our sakes, but I'm not asking you to be anything except yourself. No demands, no expectations beyond what we agree on together. You'll have your own space in the house until you decide otherwise. You'll have access to the accounts and a say in how the ranch is run. And you'll have my word that I will never use my strength or my legal rights to force you into anything you don't want." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Why would you make such promises to a stranger?" "Because I remember what it's like to have no choices," Caleb said simply. "And because the kind of marriage I want, if we get there at all, is the kind built on mutual respect, not obligation or fear." "If we get there?" Eleanor repeated. He nodded. "I'm not fool enough to think that you'll wake up tomorrow morning in love with me just because we speak some vows. These things take time. Maybe we'll build something real. Maybe we'll just be partners running a ranch together. Either way, you'll be treated with dignity." Eleanor didn't realize she was crying until a tear dropped onto her folded hands. She quickly brushed it away, embarrassed, but Caleb pretended not to notice, keeping his eyes on the road and giving her the privacy to compose herself. No one had offered her dignity in so long. Not since her mother died, really. After that, it had been creditors and lawyers and pitying looks from people who had once called themselves friends. The agency woman had spoken of marriage as if it were a last resort for damaged goods, and the whispers at the train station had made it clear that Bear Creek saw her as exactly that, something broken and cheap, hardly worth the price of transport. But this man, this stranger, was offering her something different. She didn't know if she could trust it. She didn't know if she could trust him. But she also didn't have anywhere else to go. "All right," she said quietly. "A partnership, then." Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he had been braced for refusal. "We'll take things slow. There's no rush. The ranch has been waiting this long. It can wait a bit longer while we figure each other out." They rode in silence again, but it felt different this time, less fraught. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, Eleanor could see the dark line of a tree-covered ridge, and beyond that, the mountains standing like silent sentinels. "Is it far?" she asked. "Your ranch." "Our ranch," Caleb corrected gently. "In another hour, maybe a bit more. We'll get there before dark." "Our ranch," Eleanor repeated, testing the words. They felt foreign in her mouth, but not entirely unpleasant. As they traveled, Caleb began to point out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation that marked the boundary of his land, a creek that ran reliable even in dry summers, a stand of cottonwood trees where elk sometimes gathered at dawn. He spoke about the land with genuine affection, and Eleanor found herself listening not just to his words, but to the passion beneath them. This was a man who loved his home, who had worked hard to build something here. "Do you have any family nearby?" Eleanor asked when there was a break in his descriptions. "No, parents passed years ago. I have a brother back in Kansas, but we don't talk much. You?" "No one," Eleanor said, and tried to ignore the hollow ache that always came with that admission. "I was an only child. My mother died when I was 15. And my father—" She trailed off, not wanting to speak ill of the dead, but not willing to lie either. "The agency mentioned he had some troubles," Caleb said carefully. "He gambled," Eleanor said flatly, "and drank, and made promises he couldn't keep. By the time he died, he had lost everything my mother's family had left us. I tried to hold things together, but the debts were too much. The house, the furniture, even my mother's jewelry. It all went to creditors. I was left with one carpet bag and the clothes on my back." "That's a hard thing," Caleb said, watching everything disappear like that. "The hardest part wasn't losing the things," Eleanor admitted. "It was losing the people. All those family friends who had been so kind when my mother was alive, they vanished the moment there was no money left. Suddenly, I was invisible. Or worse, I was a problem they didn't want to deal with." Caleb nodded slowly. "People have a way of showing their true nature when circumstances change." "Yes." Eleanor looked out at the endless grassland. "Is that what happened to you? Is that why you're out here alone?" A muscle twitched in Caleb's jaw. "Partly. After my parents died, I had some disagreements with folks about how the ranch should be run. They wanted me to sell off parcels, wanted me to do things their way. When I didn't, they made life difficult, questioned my decisions, spread stories, made it hard to hire help or do business." He paused. "And then there was a woman I thought I'd marry. She decided a poor rancher with a stubborn streak wasn't worth her time after all." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, and meant it. "Don't be. I learned something valuable, that being alone is better than being with people who don't respect you. I'd rather have silence than false friendship." He glanced at her. "But I'd also rather have honest partnership than isolation, if such a thing can be found." They fell into a comfortable quiet after that, and Eleanor found herself studying Caleb Warren from the corner of her eye. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, not the polished handsomeness of the Philadelphia gentleman she had once known, but something more substantial. There was strength in the line of his shoulders, competence in the way he handled the reins, and an unexpected gentleness in how he spoke to the horses. More importantly, there was integrity in him. She could sense it, the way you could sometimes sense a storm coming before you saw the clouds. This was a man who meant what he said, who valued his word. It was a rare quality, and Eleanor found herself wanting very much to believe in it. The sun was touching the horizon when the ranch finally came into view. It wasn't grand, just a solid wooden house with a wide porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals. But it was well maintained, and there was something welcoming about the way the setting sun painted the buildings in warm light. "Home," Caleb said simply. As they drew closer, Eleanor noticed a woman standing on the porch, middle-aged, sturdy-looking, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. She raised a hand in greeting, and Caleb returned the gesture. "That's Martha Pruitt," Caleb explained. "She owns the ranch that borders mine to the east. I asked her to come stay for a few days to help you settle in and to—" He hesitated, then continued, "to make things more proper. I didn't want you arriving to an empty house with just me here. Thought you might appreciate having another woman around." Eleanor felt something warm unfold in her chest. He had thought about her comfort, her sense of safety. He had anticipated that arriving alone to an isolated ranch with a strange man might be frightening, and he had taken steps to ease that fear. "Thank you," she said softly. "That was very thoughtful." Caleb shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "Just seemed like the right thing to do." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, and Martha Pruitt came down the porch steps with a welcoming smile. "You must be Eleanor," she said warmly. "Welcome to Wyoming. I've got supper keeping warm and a room all ready for you." "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt," Eleanor said, accepting Caleb's hand as he helped her down from the wagon. "Martha, please. We don't stand much on formality out here." The older woman looked Eleanor up and down with kind eyes. "You look exhausted, dear. Long journey?" "Very long," Eleanor admitted. "Well, come inside. Caleb can handle the horses. You need food and rest." As Martha led her toward the house, Eleanor glanced back at Caleb. He was already unhitching the horses, moving with practiced efficiency. As if feeling her gaze, he looked up and their eyes met. He nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both reassurance and promise. Eleanor turned and followed Martha inside. The house was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, 2 bedrooms off to one side, and what looked like a small office or study. Everything was clean and well kept, if somewhat sparse in decoration. The furniture was solid and practical, made by someone who valued function over ornament. "I've been airing things out and getting meals ready," Martha explained as she led Eleanor to one of the bedrooms. "Caleb asked me to make sure you had everything you might need. There's fresh linens on the bed, water in the pitcher, and I brought some of my own things over: soap, a brush, some lavender sachets. I know you probably lost a lot of your belongings, and I thought you might appreciate having a few comforts." Eleanor's eyes stung with unexpected tears. "That's incredibly kind of you." Martha patted her arm gently. "We women have to look after each other out here. The land is hard enough. No need for us to be hard on each other, too." She paused at the doorway. "I'll leave you to freshen up. Take your time. Supper will wait." When the door closed, Eleanor finally allowed herself to fully feel the exhaustion of the past 3 days. She sank onto the edge of the bed, which was comfortable and smelled of fresh air and lavender, and let her carefully maintained composure crack just slightly. She was here, in Wyoming, about to marry a stranger, about to build a life from nothing. It was terrifying, but it was also, she realized, the first time in years that she had felt even the faintest whisper of hope. Through the window, she could see Caleb leading the horses toward the barn. His movements were sure and steady, and there was something calming about watching him work. He had promised her dignity and partnership. He had thought about her comfort and safety. He had stood between her and the cruel whispers of the town, offering quiet solidarity. Maybe, just maybe, this desperate gamble would lead to something worth having. Eleanor stood and moved to the washstand, pouring water into the basin and washing the travel dust from her face and hands. In the mirror above the stand, her reflection looked back at her, still tired, still wary, but perhaps with slightly less fear in her eyes than there had been at the train station. "Eleanor Warren," she whispered to her reflection, testing the name. It felt strange but not unpleasant. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Eleanor?" Martha's voice called. "Supper's ready when you are." "I'll be right there," Eleanor called back. She took one more look at herself in the mirror, smoothed her hair, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. The main room felt warmer now, with lamps lit against the gathering dark and the smell of food filling the air. Caleb had come in from the barn and was washing up at a basin near the door. He had removed his hat, and Eleanor could see that his dark hair curled slightly when it wasn't pressed down. There was gray threading through it at the temples, though he couldn't have been much past 35. "Sit, sit," Martha urged, gesturing to the table. "Everything's getting cold." They sat, Caleb at the head of the table, Eleanor to his right, Martha across from her. The meal was simple but well prepared: roasted chicken, potatoes, greens from Martha's garden, and fresh bread. After days of train food, it tasted like a feast to Eleanor. "This is wonderful," she said sincerely. "Thank you, Martha." "My pleasure, dear. I'll teach you some of my recipes if you'd like. Caleb here will eat just about anything, but he does appreciate when food tastes like more than fuel." Caleb made a sound that might have been protest or agreement. Eleanor couldn't quite tell, but there was a slight upward curve to his mouth that suggested he was amused rather than offended. As they ate, Martha kept up a steady stream of conversation, filling the potentially awkward silence with talk of the ranch, the neighbors, few though they were, the weather patterns, and the upcoming town social. She was clearly trying to make Eleanor feel welcome and informed, and Eleanor appreciated it more than she could say. "Now," Martha said when the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, "I've set up a bed in the office for myself. Eleanor, you've got the back bedroom. That was Caleb's mother's room, and it has a lock on the inside if that makes you feel more comfortable. Caleb's got the front bedroom, clear on the other side of the house. I'll be staying through the wedding and a few days after, just to make sure everyone's settled." Eleanor felt Caleb's eyes on her and turned to meet his gaze. There was a question in his expression, and she realized he was checking to make sure these arrangements were acceptable to her. "That sounds fine," she said. "Thank you." The evening passed quietly. Martha told stories about the early days of her own ranch, making them laugh with tales of mishaps and misadventures. Caleb contributed less to the conversation, but listened attentively, and Eleanor got the sense that this, sitting together in the lamplight, talking about everyday things, was a luxury he had done without for too long. When Martha finally declared it was time for bed, Eleanor retreated to her room with a sense of relief. The space was simple but comfortable, with a sturdy bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Someone, Caleb, she assumed, had brought in her carpet bag and placed it carefully at the foot of the bed. She changed into her nightgown, braided her hair, and climbed into bed. The mattress was comfortable, the linens clean and fresh. Outside, she could hear the wind moving through the grass and the distant call of some night bird. It was so different from the city sounds she was used to. No carriages, no shouting, no constant hum of people living on top of each other. It was peaceful, and that peace was almost more unsettling than noise would have been. Eleanor lay in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home, and tried not to think too hard about everything that would happen in the coming days. The wedding, the town's judgment, the uncertainty of building a life with someone she barely knew. Instead, she focused on the small kindnesses she had already received: Caleb's promise of dignity, his careful consideration of her comfort, Martha's warm welcome, the solid walls of this house around her. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had expected, and for now, that would have to be enough. She was just beginning to drift toward sleep when she heard footsteps in the main room, steady, measured, pacing. After a moment, she recognized them as Caleb's. He was walking back and forth, and she could picture him moving from window to window, checking locks, making sure everything was secure, making sure she was safe. Eleanor closed her eyes and let that knowledge settle over her like a blanket. Whatever uncertainties tomorrow might bring, tonight she was safe. Tonight, she was not alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the beginning of something worth holding on to. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the darkness, carrying secrets and promises across the endless grassland. And inside the ranch house, 3 people, 2 strangers and a friend, slept under the same roof, their futures intertwined in ways none of them could yet fully understand. The town had called Eleanor Hayes a bargain bride, had reduced her worth to the price of a train ticket. But here, in this quiet house on the edge of the wilderness, she was beginning to discover that her value had never been determined by what others were willing to pay. It was determined by what she was willing to become. And that story was only just beginning. Morning came to the Wyoming ranch with a quality of light Eleanor had never experienced before. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window in shades of gold and amber, painting the simple room in colors that seemed almost sacred. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the journey that had brought her here, forgot everything except the sheer beauty of that light. Then reality settled back in, and with it came the knowledge that today she would begin learning what her new life would actually look like. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 remaining day dresses, a plain gray cotton that had seen better days but was at least clean and mended. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons, and she realized her hands were shaking slightly. Nerves, she told herself. Perfectly natural nerves for a woman about to navigate her first full day in a strange place with strange people. When she emerged from her room, she found Martha already in the kitchen, humming softly as she worked at the stove. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and Eleanor's stomach reminded her that she had eaten little the night before despite the good food. "Good morning, dear," Martha said warmly. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted. "The quiet took some getting used to." Martha laughed. "Yes, the silence out here can be louder than any city noise when you're not accustomed to it, but you'll find it becomes a comfort after a while." She gestured toward the table. "Sit. Coffee's ready, and breakfast will be just a minute." "Can I help?" Eleanor asked, not wanting to seem lazy or ungrateful. "Not this morning. You're still recovering from your journey, but starting tomorrow I'll show you how things are done around here, where everything is kept, how the stove works, what supplies we have. Caleb's kitchen is adequate but could use a woman's organizing touch." Eleanor accepted a cup of coffee and sat at the table, grateful for the strong, hot brew. "Where is Caleb?" "Been up since before dawn, I imagine. That man runs on less sleep than seems humanly possible. He's probably out checking on the cattle or mending fence or any one of 100 things that need doing on a ranch this size." Martha set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of Eleanor. "He'll come in for breakfast eventually, though with Caleb eventually could mean any time in the next 3 hours." As if summoned by their conversation, the door opened and Caleb stepped inside, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His shirt was already dusty despite the early hour, and there was a fresh scratch on his forearm that he seemed not to have noticed. "Morning," he said, his voice still carrying the roughness of limited use. His eyes found Eleanor's immediately. "Sleep all right?" "Yes, thank you." Eleanor was suddenly, acutely aware of how domestic this scene was. The 3 of them in the kitchen, breakfast on the table, morning routines unfolding. It felt both foreign and strangely natural. Caleb washed his hands and face at the basin, then joined them at the table. Martha served him a heaping plate, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. For a few minutes, they ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of utensils and Martha's occasional commentary on the quality of her biscuits. Then Caleb cleared his throat, and Eleanor knew something important was coming. "I've been thinking," he began, looking at Eleanor with that direct, serious gaze that seemed to be his natural expression. "About the wedding. The minister can come out here this Saturday if that suits you. I thought having it at the ranch might be easier than going into town. Less spectacle." Eleanor understood immediately what he wasn't saying. Less opportunity for the townspeople to gawk and whisper, less public humiliation for both of them. She felt a rush of gratitude for his consideration. "That would be preferable," she agreed. "I'll ride into town today and make the arrangements. We'll keep it simple. Just the minister, Martha as witness, maybe her husband Tom, if he's available. No fuss? No crowd." He paused, then added, almost awkwardly, "Unless you want something different. If you had hopes for a particular kind of ceremony, I'll do my best to make it happen." Eleanor thought of her mother's wedding, which she had seen in photographs, the elaborate dress, the church full of people, the reception that had lasted into the evening. She had once imagined something similar for herself, but that was a different life, a different Eleanor. "Simple suits me fine," she said. "I'm not interested in performance, just getting it done properly." Something that might have been relief crossed Caleb's face. "All right then, Saturday it is." "I have my mother's wedding dress packed away at home," Martha interjected gently. "It might need some adjusting, but you're welcome to wear it if you'd like, Eleanor. Save you having to wear a day dress for your wedding." Eleanor's throat tightened. The kindness of this woman, who barely knew her, who had no obligation to care about Eleanor's circumstances, was almost overwhelming. "I couldn't possibly." "You absolutely could," Martha said firmly. "The dress is just sitting in a trunk gathering dust. It would make me happy to see it worn again for a good purpose." She smiled. "Besides, every woman deserves to feel special on her wedding day, even if it's a simple ceremony." "Then I would be honored," Eleanor said softly. "Thank you, Martha." Caleb had been watching this exchange with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. When Martha excused herself to begin clearing the dishes, he remained seated, his coffee cup cradled in his large hands. "There's something else we need to discuss," he said quietly. "About after the wedding." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap, hidden beneath the table. Here it came. The expectations, the demands, the reality of what being a wife meant. But what Caleb said surprised her. "I meant what I told you yesterday, about taking things slow, about this being a partnership, not an ownership." He met her eyes directly. "The ceremony will make us legally married, but that's just words on paper. The real marriage, the trust, the understanding, the intimacy of it, that takes time to build. I'm not asking for anything beyond your presence and your help with the ranch. Everything else happens if and when you're ready for it to happen. And if you're never ready, then we'll find a way to make this work as business partners and nothing more." Eleanor stared at him, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "You would truly accept a marriage in name only?" "I'd prefer a real partnership eventually," Caleb admitted. "But I'd rather have an honest arrangement based on mutual respect than force something that isn't there. And I know—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I know you didn't come here because you wanted to. You came because you had to. That's not the foundation for demanding anything beyond what we agreed to." "What did you agree to?" Eleanor asked. "With the agency, I mean. What were you told to expect?" Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "They made it sound very transactional. Said I'd be getting a wife who would handle the house and help with accounts in exchange for security and provision. Made no mention of feelings or preferences or respect. Just duties." "And what did they tell me?" Eleanor said, her voice gaining an edge. "They said I would be expected to fulfill all wifely obligations in exchange for room and board. They made it very clear that once the marriage was legal, I would have no say in how those obligations were met." A muscle jumped in Caleb's jaw. "Is that why you looked so scared when you got off that train? You thought you were walking into a trap?" "I didn't know what I was walking into," Eleanor admitted. "I knew I had no other options. I knew that legally, once we married, you would have every right to do as you pleased. And I knew that many men, perhaps most men, would see nothing wrong with exercising those rights regardless of what their wife wanted." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his expression dark. When he spoke again, his voice was low and intense. "I'm not most men, and I need you to understand something, Eleanor. Truly understand it." He leaned forward slightly. "Even after we're married, even with all the legal rights I'll have on paper, you still get to say no. To anything. At any time. For any reason. Your body is yours. Your choices are yours. I will never use force or coercion or legal authority to take what you don't freely give. That's not partnership. That's not marriage. That's just cruelty with a certificate." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had spent so much time steeling herself for the worst, preparing to endure whatever this arrangement demanded of her, that this promise of autonomy felt almost too good to be true. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you offer me so much when you don't have to?" "Because I remember what it feels like to have no power," Caleb said simply. "When my parents died and the neighbors tried to tell me how to run my own ranch, tried to force me to sell, tried to make me conform to their expectations, I hated it, felt trapped, felt like I was going to suffocate under the weight of everyone else's demands." He paused. "I won't do that to someone else. I won't trap you just because the law says I can." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of this promise settling between them. Then Martha returned from the other room, breaking the intensity of the moment. "Well," she said briskly, "I think it's time I gave Eleanor a proper tour of the place. Show her where everything is, how everything works. That agreeable to you, Caleb?" "More than agreeable," Caleb said, standing. I need to ride into town anyway to talk to the minister. Eleanor, if there's anything you need from town, supplies, fabric, anything at all, let me know before I leave." Eleanor thought of her nearly empty carpet bag, her 2 worn dresses, her complete lack of everything. But pride made her hesitate. She had already accepted so much charity. "Don't be stubborn," Martha said, reading her expression perfectly. "The man's offering because he wants to help. Let him." "Some fabric would be helpful," Eleanor admitted. "I need to make at least 1 more dress, and thread and needles if they're available." "I'll get what I can," Caleb promised. He retrieved his hat from the peg and paused at the door. "Eleanor?" She looked up. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Martha smiled knowingly. That man doesn't say much, but what he does say, he means. "I'm beginning to see that," Eleanor murmured. The tour of the ranch took most of the morning. Martha showed Eleanor the kitchen's organization, the pantry stocked with preserved foods and staples, the root cellar where vegetables and smoked meats were stored. She explained the stove's quirks, demonstrated how to work the pump for water, and pointed out which pots and pans were best for which purposes. "Caleb does most of his own cooking when he's alone," Martha explained, "but he's not fancy about it. Keeps things simple and functional. But he appreciates good food when it's available, and he's always grateful for the effort." They moved outside next, and Martha showed Eleanor the chicken coop, currently housing a dozen hens and 1 rooster who eyed them with territorial suspicion. The garden area, now dormant for the approaching winter but showing signs of having been productive in warmer months. The barn, massive and well-organized, where several horses nickered at their approach. "Caleb's good with animals," Martha said as Eleanor cautiously stroked a mare's velvet nose. "Patient with them. Treats them with respect. You'll find he approaches most of life that way. Steady, careful, respectful of living things." They walked the perimeter of the immediate ranch area, and Martha pointed out landmarks, explained boundaries, and shared stories about the land and its history. Eleanor learned that Caleb had inherited this ranch from his parents 10 years ago, that he had built most of the outbuildings himself, that he ran cattle and horses, and worked harder than any 3 men Martha knew. "He's lonely, though," Martha said quietly as they stood looking out at the grazing cattle. "Tries to hide it, but I can see it. Tom and I invite him to dinner at least once a month, and he always comes, but he always leaves early. Like he doesn't quite know how to be around people anymore. Like he's forgotten how to belong." "Is that why he sent for a mail-order bride?" Eleanor asked. "The loneliness?" "Partly, but also practicality. This ranch is too much for one person, and Caleb's stubborn about asking for help. Hiring hands would solve some problems but create others. More mouths to feed, more personalities to manage, more opportunities for conflict. A wife, though, a partner, that could solve multiple problems at once, if it's the right match. And you think I might be the right match?" Eleanor couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Martha turned to look at her directly. "I think you're both survivors. I think you've both been hurt by circumstances and people. I think you both value honesty and hard work. And I think if you give each other a chance, you might build something good here." She paused. "But it won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." They returned to the house, and Martha spent the afternoon teaching Eleanor the account books. Caleb kept meticulous records, every expense, every sale, every head of cattle, every pound of feed. The numbers told the story of a ranch that was profitable but not wealthy, successful but always one bad season away from struggle. "He'll want you to handle this eventually," Martha explained. "He's good with the physical work but finds the bookkeeping tedious. If you have a head for numbers, it'll be a weight off his shoulders." Eleanor did have a head for numbers. Her mother had insisted she learn accounting and household management, skills that had seemed pointless in her privileged Philadelphia life but were proving invaluable now. She studied the books carefully, noting Caleb's organizational system, understanding his financial situation. He was honest, she realized. Every cent accounted for, no hidden expenses or mysterious purchases. The books were a window into his character, and what she saw there reassured her. Caleb returned in the late afternoon, his horse loaded with supplies from town. He had purchased generous amounts of fabric, practical calico in several colors, along with thread, needles, buttons, and even a few yards of lace trim that seemed almost frivolous amid the functional items. The shopkeeper's wife helped me choose, he admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. I'm not much good at knowing what's needed for making dresses. You did wonderfully, Eleanor assured him, running her hands over the fabric. It wasn't fancy, but it was good quality, and there was enough of it. She could make several dresses from this, maybe even a skirt and blouse for working around the ranch. I also spoke to Reverend Matthews, Caleb continued. He'll come out Saturday morning, says the ceremony won't take long, and he's willing to stay for a meal afterward if we'd like. That would be nice, Eleanor said. If it's not too much trouble, Martha? No trouble at all, Martha assured her. I'll prepare something special. A wedding deserves a celebration, even a simple one. That evening, after supper, Martha brought out the wedding dress she had promised. It was lovely, simple but elegant, made of ivory cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. When Eleanor tried it on, it fit reasonably well, needing only minor adjustments to the hem and waist. You look beautiful, dear, Martha said warmly, like a proper bride. Eleanor studied herself in the small mirror, trying to see what Martha saw. She looked pale and nervous, but there was something else there, too. A determination, perhaps. A quiet strength that hadn't been there when she left Philadelphia. Thank you, she said again, for perhaps the 100th time since arriving. For everything. You've been so kind to a complete stranger. You're not a stranger, Martha said firmly. You're going to be Caleb's wife, which makes you family. And out here, family takes care of each other. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and learning. Martha taught Eleanor the rhythms of ranch life, the early rising, the constant work, the satisfaction of tasks completed. Eleanor proved to be a quick study, and she found she enjoyed the physical labor more than she had expected. There was something deeply satisfying about kneading bread, gathering eggs, mending clothes, tasks that produced tangible, useful results. Caleb maintained a respectful distance, careful not to intrude on the time Eleanor spent with Martha. But he was always present at meals, and Eleanor began to look forward to these times when the three of them would sit together and share the day's events. Caleb spoke more in these conversations than he seemed to anywhere else, and Eleanor caught glimpses of a keen intelligence and dry humor beneath his quiet exterior. On Thursday evening, Martha's husband Tom arrived to escort her home for the night. She would return Saturday morning for the wedding. The house felt strangely empty with just Eleanor and Caleb there, and Eleanor found herself uncertain of how to navigate this new dynamic. They sat together in the main room after supper, Eleanor working on final adjustments to the wedding dress while Caleb reviewed the account books. The silence was comfortable, but charged with awareness, two people very conscious of being alone together for the first time. The books are well organized, Caleb said eventually. Martha said you picked up the system quickly. My mother taught me, Eleanor replied, keeping her eyes on her sewing. She said a woman should always understand finances, even if she never has to manage them herself. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Eleanor paused in her sewing. What were your parents like? Caleb considered the question carefully, as he seemed to consider everything. Hard workers. Fair-minded. My father built this ranch from nothing, and my mother worked beside him every step of the way. They treated each other as equals, made decisions together. I suppose that's where I got my ideas about what a marriage should look like. They were lucky to find each other, Eleanor said softly. They were, but it wasn't luck that kept them together. It was choice. Every day, choosing to respect each other, support each other, work together. He looked up from the books. That's what I want, Eleanor, if we can build it. That kind of partnership. Eleanor met his gaze. I want that too. I don't know if I know how. My parents' marriage wasn't like that. My father made all the decisions and my mother learned to live with them. Even the good ones came from his authority, not their partnership. Then we'll both be learning as we go, Caleb said, figuring it out together. Friday brought a complication neither of them had anticipated. A rancher from town, a man named Garrett Cole, arrived at midday with two of his ranch hands. Caleb's expression darkened the moment he saw them approach, and Eleanor sensed tension immediately. Stay inside, Caleb said quietly to Eleanor. This might get unpleasant. But Eleanor, contrary and curious, watched from the window as Caleb went out to meet the men. Cole, Caleb said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. Warren, Cole replied. He was a large man, thick through the shoulders and middle, with a face that suggested he smiled rarely and meant it even less often. Heard you sent for a mail-order bride. Came to see if the rumors were true. My personal business is none of your concern. It's concern of the whole town when you start bringing strangers out here. We have a right to know who's settling in our community. She's not settling in your community. She's settling on my ranch, which, last I checked, is my property and my affair. Cole's eyes narrowed. You always were an unfriendly son of a— Watch your language, Caleb interrupted sharply. There's a lady present. He gestured toward the house, where Eleanor knew she was visible in the window. Cole turned his attention to the house, and Eleanor felt his gaze like a physical thing, assessing, judging, finding her wanting. That her? Doesn't look like much from here. What did you pay for her? The change in Caleb was immediate and frightening. One moment he was tense but controlled. The next, he had covered the distance between himself and Cole and was standing toe-to-toe with the larger man, his voice low and dangerous. You ever speak about my wife that way again? Caleb said, each word precise and sharp as a blade. And you and I are going to have a serious problem, one that won't be solved with words. Cole's ranch hands tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but Cole held up a hand to stop them. He studied Caleb with new respect, or perhaps wariness. Didn't mean offense, Cole said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just curious about the new Mrs. Warren. Well, you've satisfied your curiosity. Now you can leave my property. Fine. But Warren, you remember what I said before. This ranch is too much for one man. If you ever decide to sell parcels, I'm willing to pay fair price for the eastern section. I've told you before, and I'll tell you once more. This ranch isn't being divided or sold. Not now. Not ever. Now get off my land. Cole smiled without warmth. We'll see how long that stubborn streak lasts. Winters are hard out here for a man alone, even harder with a wife to provide for. He turned his horse and rode off with his men, leaving Caleb standing in the yard, tension radiating from every line of his body. Eleanor opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Who was that? Caleb turned to face her, and she could see him working to control his anger. Garrett Cole. Owns the ranch north of here. He's been trying to buy parts of my land for years. Thinks I'll eventually give in from the pressure. Pressure? Caleb climbed the porch steps and leaned against the railing, his expression weary. He makes things difficult, spreads rumors in town, questions my competence, turns people against me, makes it hard to hire help or get fair prices. He wants this land, and he's patient enough to wear me down slowly. That's why people in town were so hostile, Eleanor realized. He's been poisoning them against you. Partly, though to be fair, I haven't helped my own case. I'm not good with people, don't socialize much, keep to myself. Makes it easy for folks to believe whatever story Cole tells them. Eleanor moved to stand beside him at the railing. And now he thinks I'm a weakness he can exploit. Another mouth to feed, another burden you can't afford. He thinks wrong, Caleb said firmly. You're not a burden. You're a partner. And together, we're stronger than I was alone. Eleanor wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that this arrangement, born of desperation and circumstance, could become the partnership Caleb envisioned. But Cole's visit had reminded her of a harsh reality. The world would not make it easy for them. The town had already judged her. Men like Cole would look for any weakness, any opportunity to take what Caleb had built. We should go inside, Caleb said quietly. No point giving Cole any more to look at or talk about. That evening was subdued. Caleb was withdrawn, lost in thoughts he didn't share, and Eleanor found herself watching him with concern. He seemed to carry the weight of the entire ranch on his shoulders, accepting no help, trusting no one. It was a lonely way to live. Caleb, she said finally, breaking the silence, tomorrow, when we're married, truly married, I need you to know that I'm not just accepting your protection. I'm offering mine as well. Whatever struggles this ranch faces, we face them together. That's what partnership means. He looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering in his dark eyes. I'm not used to having someone on my side. Get used to it, Eleanor said firmly. Because I don't abandon my commitments, and I don't back down from bullies like Garrett Cole. If he wants this ranch, he'll have to go through both of us. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger and less burdened. "I believe you might be exactly what this ranch needed," he said quietly. "And you," Eleanor replied, "might be exactly what I needed too." Saturday morning arrived bright and clear, and with it came Martha and Tom Pruitt, along with Reverend Matthews. Eleanor dressed in the borrowed wedding gown, her hands steadier than she expected. This was happening. In less than an hour, she would be Eleanor Warren, married to a man she had known for less than a week. But strangely, she felt no panic. Only a quiet certainty that this was the right choice, not because it was the only choice, but because Caleb Warren was proving to be a man worth choosing. The ceremony was brief and simple, conducted in the main room of the ranch house. Eleanor and Caleb stood before Reverend Matthews and spoke the traditional vows, their voices steady and clear. When Caleb slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring, Martha had whispered, Eleanor felt the weight of it like a promise. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Matthews said with a smile. Caleb hesitated, his eyes meeting Eleanor's in silent question. She gave the smallest nod, and he leaned down to press a gentle, respectful kiss to her lips. It was chaste and brief, but Eleanor felt the sincerity in it, the promise of patience, of respect, of possibilities yet to unfold. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Warren," the Reverend said warmly. They shared the meal Martha had prepared, and for a few hours, the small gathering felt almost festive. Tom told stories, Martha fussed over the food, and Reverend Matthews shared wisdom about marriage that was surprisingly practical and unpreachy. Through it all, Caleb and Eleanor sat side by side, learning the strange new reality of being husband and wife. When their guests finally departed in the late afternoon, Eleanor and Caleb stood on the porch and watched them go. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Well, Mrs. Warren," Caleb said quietly. "Here we are." "Here we are," Eleanor agreed. She looked down at the ring on her finger, then up at the man beside her, her husband. "What happens now?" "Now," Caleb said, "we figure out how to be married, one day at a time. No rush, no pressure, just learning each other." Eleanor nodded, feeling the rightness of that approach. One day at a time. They stood together in the fading light, two people who had come to this marriage as strangers, bound by circumstance and need. But standing there on the porch of what was now their shared home, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something more. Not love, not yet, but the foundation upon which love might eventually be built. Respect, trust, partnership. It was more than she had dared hope for, and it was, she realized, worth fighting to protect. The first 2 weeks of marriage settled into a rhythm that surprised Eleanor with its comfort. She and Caleb worked side by side during the days, learning each other's habits and preferences without the awkwardness she had feared. He taught her about the cattle and horses, showed her how to mend fence and recognize signs of weather changes in the vast Wyoming sky. She took over the account books completely and reorganized the kitchen to her liking, and Caleb accepted her changes without complaint. They were careful with each other, respectful of boundaries, but Eleanor could feel something growing between them, a genuine fondness, a partnership that was beginning to feel less like an arrangement and more like a choice they were both making every day. The nights remained separate. Caleb kept to his room at the front of the house, Eleanor to hers at the back, and neither pushed for more than the other was ready to give. But sometimes, in the evenings, they would sit together on the porch and talk about everything and nothing, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to those quiet conversations more than she wanted to admit. It was during one of these peaceful evenings that Caleb mentioned he would need to make a trip to the far pasture to check on the cattle that grazed there. "It's a 2-day ride out and back," he explained, his eyes on the darkening horizon. "I should have gone last week, but with the wedding and getting you settled, I put it off. Can't put it off any longer." Eleanor felt an unexpected flutter of anxiety at the thought of being alone on the ranch, but she pushed it down. She was a grown woman, not a child, and Caleb couldn't postpone necessary work just because she was nervous about solitude. "When will you leave?" she asked. "Day after tomorrow, if the weather holds. I'll be back late on the second day." He glanced at her, concern evident in his expression. "Will you be all right here alone?" "Of course," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. I'm perfectly capable of managing for 2 days. I know you are, but still, if anything happens, anything at all that concerns you, ride to the Pruitts. They're only an hour east. Martha would be happy to have you stay until I get back. I'll be fine, Caleb. You worry too much. He smiled slightly. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just getting used to having someone to worry about. The morning Caleb left, he made her repeat the directions to the Pruitts' ranch 3 times. He showed her where he kept his rifle and made sure she knew how to load and fire it, though Eleanor had never held a gun before and hoped desperately she would never need to use it. He left her detailed instructions about caring for the animals and a list of tasks she might work on in his absence, though he emphasized that none of them were urgent. Lock the doors at night, he said, as he prepared to mount his horse. All of them. And if you hear anything suspicious, anything that doesn't feel right, don't investigate. Just get to safety. You're being overly cautious, Eleanor said, though his concern touched her. What could possibly happen? Caleb's expression darkened. Out here, plenty. Wild animals, drifters, men like Garrett Cole who might see an opportunity in my absence. He caught her hand briefly. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise, Eleanor said, squeezing his hand in return. And you promise me you'll come back safely. I will. He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, then looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. 2 days, Eleanor. I'll be back before you know it. She watched him ride away until he disappeared into the distance, then turned back to the house that suddenly seemed much larger and lonelier than it had moments before. The first day passed uneventfully. Eleanor threw herself into work, finding comfort in the familiar tasks. She reorganized the pantry, mended several of Caleb's shirts that had needed attention, worked in the garden preparing it for winter, and spent the evening reviewing the account books by lamplight. By the time she went to bed, she was exhausted enough that her unease about being alone barely registered. The second day started just as peacefully. Eleanor woke early, tended to the chickens and horses, made herself a simple breakfast, and was just beginning to knead dough for bread when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart leaped with hope. Perhaps Caleb had finished his work early and was returning. But when she looked out the window, her hope turned to ice in her veins. 3 men were riding toward the house, and none of them was Caleb. They were rough-looking, dressed in worn clothes and carrying themselves with the swagger of men who were used to taking what they wanted. The one in the lead was tall and lean, with a cruel mouth and eyes that assessed the ranch like a predator sizing up prey. Eleanor's mind raced. Caleb had said to get to safety if anything felt wrong, but these men were already too close. She would never make it to her horse in time to ride for the Pruitts. And something in the way they were approaching, something in the deliberate slowness of their pace, told her they knew exactly what they would find here. They knew Caleb was gone. They knew she was alone. Her eyes fell on the rifle Caleb had showed her, propped in the corner near the door. She had never fired it, wasn't even entirely sure she could, but it was the only defense she had. She grabbed it with trembling hands, checked that it was loaded as Caleb had taught her, and positioned herself near the window where she could see but hopefully not be seen clearly. The men reined in their horses about 20 feet from the house. The leader swung down from his saddle with easy confidence, and Eleanor's stomach turned when she recognized something familiar in his features. She had seen him before, or someone who looked like him. Where? Then it hit her. Garrett Cole. This man had the same hard eyes, the same cruel set to his mouth. A relative, perhaps. Or an associate. Mrs. Warren! The man called out, his voice carrying a mocking tone that made Eleanor's skin crawl. Come on out here. We just want to have a friendly conversation. Eleanor said nothing, her finger resting near the rifle's trigger, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Now don't be unfriendly, the man continued. We know you're in there, saw you through the window earlier, and we know your husband rode out yesterday. Saw him ourselves, heading toward the far pasture, which means you're all alone out here, vulnerable, unprotected. One of the other men laughed, a sound that held no humor. Come out, bargain bride. Let's see what Warren was willing to pay for. The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. They knew. They knew what the town had called her, knew about the circumstances of her marriage, knew exactly how to wound her with their mockery. My husband will be back soon, Eleanor called out, proud that her voice remained steady despite her terror. And he won't take kindly to finding unwelcome visitors on his property. Oh, I don't think he'll be back that soon, the leader said. In fact, I'd wager he won't be back until late tomorrow at the earliest. Those far pastures are a good ride out. And even if he did come back early, well, we'd be long gone by then, along with anything we decide to take with us. Eleanor's blood ran cold. If you're here to steal, there's nothing of value in this house. Just take what you want and go. Now see, that's where you're wrong, Mrs. Warren. The man took a step closer to the house, and Eleanor raised the rifle so the barrel was visible in the window. He stopped, but he didn't look particularly concerned. There's something very valuable in that house, something Warren paid good money to import all the way from Philadelphia, and I'm real curious to see if you were worth the investment. My name is Silas Reed, the man said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather and not Eleanor's imminent assault. Maybe your husband mentioned me. We have some history, Warren and I. Goes back a few years to a disagreement over some cattle. He cost me a lot of money and a fair bit of pride. I've been waiting for a chance to return the favor. Eleanor's mind raced. This was about Caleb, about some old feud she knew nothing about. She was just a convenient target, a way to hurt him when he wasn't here to defend himself. Whatever issues you have with my husband, Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice calm and reasonable, they have nothing to do with me. I'm asking you, as one human being to another, to leave this property now. Oh, but they have everything to do with you, Silas said, his voice hardening. You're Warren's wife. You're his property, legally speaking, which means hurting you hurts him, and I've been waiting a long time to hurt Caleb Warren. He took another step forward, and this time Eleanor pulled the rifle's hammer back with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the tense silence. I know how to use this, she lied, and I will shoot you if you come any closer. Silas stopped again, but now he was smiling. You ever killed a man before, Mrs. Warren? It's not as easy as it looks. It takes a certain kind of hardness, a certain kind of resolve. And you, he looked her up and down with contempt. You're just a desperate woman who sold herself for security. You don't have that kind of steel in you. You'd be surprised what desperate people are capable of, Eleanor said, and was gratified to hear the steel in her own voice, even if she didn't feel it in her heart. Maybe, Silas conceded, but here's the thing. You've got one shot in that rifle before you need to reload. Maybe, if you're very lucky and very skilled, you hit one of us. But there's three of us, which means even in the best-case scenario, two of us are getting through that door. And then he let the sentence hang, the threat implicit. Eleanor's hands were shaking now, her palms sweating on the rifle's stock. He was right. Even if she managed to shoot one of them, and she wasn't at all confident she could, the others would be on her in seconds. She was trapped, and they all knew it. What do you want? She asked, hating the tremor in her voice. I already told you. I want to hurt Warren, and the best way to do that is to take something he values. Or in your case, his smile turned vicious, something he paid for. I am not property, Eleanor said fiercely. I am a human being, and I am not something to be taken or traded or used to settle your petty grudges. That's real pretty sentiment, Silas said, but sentiment doesn't change the law, and the law says you're Warren's wife, which makes you Warren's responsibility, which makes you Warren's weakness. Now, you can make this easy and come out, or you can make it hard and we break down that door. Either way, we're having our conversation. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. She could try to hold them off until dark, then slip out and run for the Pruitts. But that was hours away, and she didn't think they would wait that long. She could fire a shot to try to scare them off, but that would waste her only bullet and likely only anger them. She could barricade herself in one of the bedrooms, but they would eventually break through any barrier she could construct. There was no good option, no escape, no rescue coming. She was alone. The thought crystallized something in Eleanor's mind. She had been alone before. Alone when her mother died. Alone when her father gambled away their future. Alone when the creditors came and the friends disappeared. She had survived all of that. She had endured humiliation and loss and the complete destruction of everything she had known, and she had come out the other side stronger than before. These men thought she was weak because she had been desperate enough to accept a mail-order marriage. They thought she was broken because circumstances had forced her across the country to a stranger's ranch. They thought she would crumble under their threats because they had reduced her to a price tag, to a transaction, to something bought and owned. They were wrong. Eleanor took a deep breath and made a decision. If these men were going to hurt her, they were going to have to work for it. She was not going to make it easy. She was not going to surrender her dignity without a fight. "I'm going to tell you one more time," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Leave this property now, or I will shoot you. And if I die defending this house, at least I'll die knowing I didn't make it easy for cowards who prey on women." Silas's expression darkened. "Wrong answer, Mrs. Warren." He nodded to his companions, and they dismounted. Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger, her entire body tense with fear and determination. She picked Silas as her target. If she was only going to get one shot, she would aim for the leader. The three men started toward the house, spreading out to make themselves harder targets. Eleanor tracked Silas with the rifle barrel, waiting for the moment when he was close enough that even her inexperience might not matter. 10 feet away. 8 feet. 6. She was just about to pull the trigger when she heard it, the thunder of approaching hooves, moving fast, very fast. All four of them froze, turning toward the sound. Over the ridge to the east, a horse and rider appeared, moving at a full gallop. Even at a distance, Eleanor recognized both the horse and the rider. Caleb. He must have seen the strange horses, must have known immediately that something was wrong. He drove his horse harder, closing the distance with terrifying speed, and Eleanor could see even from here that his face was set in an expression of cold fury. Silas cursed viciously. "Mount up," he barked to his companions. "Now!" But Caleb was already too close. He pulled his horse to a sliding stop in front of the house and was out of the saddle before the animal had even fully halted. In his hand was his own rifle, and unlike Eleanor, there was no hesitation in how he held it, no uncertainty in his stance. "Step away from my house," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. "Step away from my wife, and start explaining why I shouldn't shoot you where you stand." "Warren," Silas said, trying for bravado, but not quite achieving it, "didn't expect you back so soon." "Clearly." Caleb's eyes flicked to Eleanor in the window, and she saw something fierce and protective flare in them when he registered the terror in her face. "Eleanor, are you hurt?" "No," she managed. "They haven't touched me." "Good." His attention returned to Silas, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That's the only reason you're still breathing. Now talk fast. What are you doing on my property threatening my wife?" "Just came to have a conversation," Silas said, but his earlier confidence was evaporating in the face of Caleb's controlled rage. "No harm intended." "No harm intended," Caleb repeated, his voice flat and disbelieving. "You rode onto my land while you knew I was gone. You approached my house with 3 armed men. You terrorized my wife. And you expect me to believe no harm was intended?" "Look, Warren, this doesn't have to get ugly." "It's already ugly," Caleb interrupted. "Question is whether it gets deadly. Because I'm trying very hard to remember that murder is illegal, but I'm finding my commitment to the law somewhat strained at the moment." Eleanor had never heard Caleb speak this way, cold and hard and absolutely certain. This was a different man from the gentle, patient partner she had come to know. This was a man who had clearly been pushed too far and was no longer interested in restraint. "This is about that cattle dispute from 3 years ago, isn't it?" Caleb continued. "You're still angry that I caught you trying to rebrand my stock, still bitter that I reported you instead of looking the other way. So you thought you'd get revenge by coming after my wife while I was gone." "She's a bargain bride," Silas spat, his mask of civility finally dropping completely. "A woman who sold herself for the price of a train ticket. I was just curious if she was worth even that much." The change in Caleb was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he was standing still, the next he had crossed the distance to Silas and driven the butt of his rifle into the other man's stomach with brutal efficiency. Silas doubled over, gasping, and Caleb grabbed him by the collar and dragged him upright. "Listen to me very carefully," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "That woman in that house is worth more than you could comprehend. She's braver than any man I know, stronger than circumstances that would have broken a lesser person. and she has more integrity in her smallest finger than you have in your entire worthless body. And if you ever speak about her that way again, if you ever come near her again, if you even think about her in a way I don't like, I will end you. Legal consequences be damned." He shoved Silas backward, and the man stumbled, barely catching his balance. His two companions had already started backing toward their horses, clearly wanting no part of this confrontation. "She's priceless," Caleb said, his eyes boring into Silas. "You understand me? Priceless. Which is why you're going to get on your horse right now and ride away. And you're going to tell everyone you know that Eleanor Warren is under my protection, and anyone who threatens her answers to me." "You're making a mistake, Warren," Silas said, trying to salvage some dignity as he moved toward his horse. "You're making enemies you can't afford." "I've had enemies my entire life," Caleb said. "One more doesn't scare me. But you should be scared, because if I see you on my land again, I won't ask questions. I'll just shoot." Silas mounted his horse, his face dark with fury and humiliation. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Caleb said flatly. "You just don't know it yet. Now get off my property before I change my mind about letting you leave breathing." The three men rode away, and Caleb stood watching until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he seem to remember how to move, turning toward the house where Eleanor still stood, frozen at the window. She opened the door with shaking hands, the rifle nearly falling from her grip. Caleb took the stairs two at a time and caught the weapon before it could clatter to the porch, setting it aside carefully before turning his full attention to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked again, his hands hovering near her shoulders but not quite touching, as if afraid she might break. "Did they touch you? Did they—" "No," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. "They just talked, threatened. But you came before they could, before anything." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to what might have happened if Caleb had been even 5 minutes later. "Come here," Caleb said softly, and opened his arms in invitation. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She stepped into his embrace, and his arms closed around her with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had just displayed. She could feel his heart hammering against her cheek, could feel the tension still thrumming through his muscles, could feel the barely controlled rage that he was holding back for her sake. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I should never have left you alone. I should have anticipated that someone might—" "You couldn't have known," Eleanor interrupted. "And I'm all right. I'm safe. You came in time." "Barely." His arms tightened around her. "If I hadn't decided to come back early, if I hadn't seen their horses from the ridge, if I had been even a few minutes later—" "But you weren't," Eleanor said firmly. She pulled back enough to look up at him, seeing the anguish in his eyes. "You came back. You protected me. That's what matters." Caleb's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "When I saw them at the house, when I realized you were alone with 3 armed men, He stopped, swallowed hard. "I've never been that scared in my entire life." "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted. "I didn't know what to do. I had the rifle, but I've never shot anyone, never even shot at anything. And there were 3 of them, and I knew that even if I got one, the others would—" Her voice broke, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Shh," Caleb soothed, pulling her close again. "It's over. They're gone. I won't let anyone hurt you." They stood like that for long minutes, Eleanor drawing strength from Caleb's solid presence, Caleb visibly struggling to calm himself. When they finally separated, Caleb's jaw was set with grim determination. "We need to ride to town tomorrow," he said. "Report this to the sheriff. Silas Reed is a known troublemaker, but threatening you crosses a line. He needs to face consequences." "Will the sheriff actually do anything?" Eleanor asked, thinking of the hostile faces at the train station, the whispers and judgment. "He will, if I make it clear that I won't accept anything less," Caleb said. "And we'll stop by the Pruitts, too, let them know what happened. Tom will spread the word among the neighboring ranches. Men out here might not all like me, but most of them respect the sanctity of a man's home and his wife's safety. Reed will find himself with fewer friends after today." Eleanor nodded, then asked the question that had been forming in her mind since Caleb had confronted Silas. "What you said to him about me being priceless, did you mean it?" Caleb looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath. Every word. You're not a bargain, Eleanor. You're not cheap. You're not something I bought or own or can put a value on. You're my partner, my wife, and anyone who tries to harm you will have to go through me first. Something warm and powerful unfurled in Eleanor's chest. This man, who barely knew her, who had married her out of practical necessity, was willing to risk his life to protect her, was willing to make enemies to defend her honor, saw her not as property or burden, but as someone precious. Thank you, she whispered, for coming back, for believing I was worth protecting. Always, Caleb said simply. Then, almost awkwardly, he added, I finished the work at the far pasture faster than expected. Thought I'd surprise you by coming home early. Turns out my timing was more important than I realized. Turns out your instincts were right, Eleanor said. About needing to protect me, about this ranch attracting trouble, about all of it. I hate that I was right, Caleb said darkly. I hate that you had to experience that fear, that you had to stand alone against men who would have hurt you without a second thought. I wasn't completely alone, Eleanor said. I had the rifle you showed me how to use. I had the knowledge of where to go for help. And I had the absolute certainty that if I could just hold on long enough, you would come back for me. She managed a small smile. Turns out, I was right too. Caleb's expression softened. Let's go inside. You're shaking, and I could use a cup of coffee strong enough to strip paint. They went into the house together, and Caleb bolted the door behind them with deliberate care. While Eleanor put coffee on to boil, he checked every window, every lock, every possible entry point. Only when he was satisfied that the house was secure did he finally sit at the table, though Eleanor could see the tension hadn't fully left his shoulders. I'm not leaving you alone again, he said abruptly. Not until we're certain Reed has gotten the message and won't try anything else. Caleb, you can't let one incident change how you run the ranch. Yes, I can, he interrupted. The ranch matters, but not as much as your safety. If I need to hire hands or ask Tom Pruitt for help or reorganize how I do everything, that's what I'll do. I won't risk you again. Eleanor set a cup of coffee in front of him and took the chair across from him. We're partners, remember? That means we make these decisions together, and I say we don't let Silas Reed dictate how we live our lives. Eleanor, no, listen to me. She leaned forward, her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup for warmth. Those men came here to make me feel small, to remind me that I'm just a bargain bride, to prove that I'm vulnerable and weak. If we change everything because of them, if we live in fear, then they win. They get to define who I am and what I'm worth. Caleb was quiet for a moment, studying her face. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we report them. We make sure people know what happened. We take reasonable precautions, but we don't hide. We don't let them turn this ranch into a prison. And we definitely don't let them make me into a victim who needs constant protection. She paused. I need to learn to actually shoot that rifle. I need to know more about defending this property. I need to be stronger, more capable. Will you teach me? A slow smile spread across Caleb's face, pride evident in his expression. You are already stronger and more capable than most people I know. But yes, I'll teach you. Everything I know about survival out here, about defending what's yours, about being truly self-sufficient. If that's what you want. It is, Eleanor said firmly, because this is my home now. This ranch, this life, this partnership, it's mine as much as yours. And I'll be damned if I let people like Silas Reed take it from me. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand. We're going to be all right, you and I. We're going to build something here that no one can tear down. Eleanor squeezed his hand in return, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers, the promise in his touch. Yes, she agreed. We are. As the sun set over the Wyoming grassland and darkness settled around the ranch house, Eleanor and Caleb sat together in the lamplight, planning for tomorrow and all the tomorrows after. The fear from earlier hadn't completely faded. Eleanor knew it would be a long time before she felt entirely safe alone. But it was tempered now by determination and by the solid certainty of partnership. Silas Reed had called her a bargain bride, had tried to use that label as a weapon to diminish and terrorize her. But Caleb had called her priceless, had defended her with a ferocity that left no room for doubt about how he valued her. And Eleanor was beginning to understand that her worth had never been determined by the price of a train ticket or the circumstances that brought her to Wyoming. It was determined by her courage in the face of terror, her refusal to surrender her dignity, her choice to build a life rather than merely survive one. The town might still whisper. Garrett Cole and his associates might still scheme. Silas Reed might still harbor his grudge. But Eleanor Warren, no longer Eleanor Hayes, no longer a desperate woman with no choices, was done being defined by other people's judgments. She was priceless, and she was just beginning to believe it. The ride into Bear Creek the next morning felt entirely different from Eleanor's first arrival. Then, she had been alone and frightened, facing a crowd of strangers who viewed her as nothing more than entertainment. Now she rode beside Caleb, their horses moving in easy rhythm, and though anxiety still churned in her stomach at the thought of facing the town again, she was not afraid. Not with Caleb's solid presence beside her, not with the memory of his fierce defense still fresh in her mind. Caleb had been quiet since they left the ranch. His jaw set in that determined line Eleanor was learning meant he was preparing for a difficult confrontation. His hand rested near his holstered pistol, and his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. He was taking no chances, leaving nothing to accident. "You don't have to come inside with me when I talk to the sheriff," he said as they crested the hill that revealed Bear Creek in the distance. "You could wait at the general store, or—" "I'm coming with you," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "This happened to me. I have a right to tell my side of it." Caleb glanced at her, and something like approval flickered in his dark eyes. "All right, but if the sheriff gives you any trouble, any suggestion that you're exaggerating or that you somehow invited Reed's attention, you let me handle it." "I can handle the sheriff myself," Eleanor said, though she appreciated Caleb's protective instinct. "I've dealt with worse than small-town skepticism." They rode into Bear Creek just before noon, when the main street was busy with people going about their daily business. Eleanor felt eyes turn toward them immediately, felt the familiar weight of judgment and curiosity. But this time she kept her chin high and her gaze forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. Caleb tied their horses in front of the sheriff's office, a small wooden building that looked like it had seen better days. He helped Eleanor down from her saddle with the same careful courtesy he always showed, then held the door open for her. The sheriff was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a face that suggested he was tired of dealing with people's problems. He looked up from his desk when they entered, and Eleanor saw his expression shift through several emotions: surprise, wariness, and something that might have been resignation. "Warren," he said by way of greeting. "Mrs. Warren, what brings you to town?" "We need to report a crime, Sheriff Daniels," Caleb said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Yesterday afternoon, while I was away from the ranch, 3 men rode onto my property with the intent to harm my wife. I want them arrested and charged." Daniel sat back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "That's a serious accusation. You got proof of this intent to harm?" "I have my wife's testimony and my own eyes," Caleb said. "I arrived to find Silas Reed and 2 associates surrounding my house, threatening Eleanor. Reed made his intentions very clear." At the mention of Silas Reed's name, Daniel's expression soured further. "Reed's a troublemaker, I'll grant you that. But threatening and doing are 2 different things. Did he actually hurt your wife? Damage your property? Steal anything?" "He terrorized her," Caleb said, his voice hardening. "He approached the house with armed men while he knew I was away. He made explicit threats about harming her to get revenge on me. That's criminal trespass and assault, Sheriff, at minimum." Daniels turned his attention to Eleanor. "Is that how you remember it, Mrs. Warren? Or is your husband maybe exaggerating a bit for effect?" Eleanor felt her temper flare at the condescension in his tone, but she kept her voice level. "Sheriff, 3 armed men approached my home while I was alone. The leader, who identified himself as Silas Reed, made it clear he intended to hurt me as revenge for some past conflict with my husband. He and his companions made explicitly threatening statements about my value as a woman and what they intended to do to me. I had to threaten them with a rifle to keep them at bay until my husband returned. There was no exaggeration, only terror." Something in her tone must have gotten through to Daniels, because his expression shifted slightly. "Reed said all this out loud?" Stated his intentions clearly? He said plenty, Eleanor replied, including calling me a bargain bride and suggesting I wasn't worth the price of the train ticket my husband paid. He made it clear he saw me as property to be taken and used as he saw fit. Daniels rubbed his face wearily. Look, Mrs. Warren, I'm not saying I don't believe you, but Reed's going to deny all of this. It'll be your word against his. And Reed's got friends in this town, people who'll back whatever story he tells. And what do we have, Sheriff? Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. What support can we expect from the law when 3 men threaten my wife on my own property? I'll have a talk with Reed, Daniels said. Make it clear he needs to stay away from your ranch. But unless you've got witnesses or physical evidence, I can't arrest him on just testimony. So if I had let them hurt her, Caleb said slowly, if I had arrived 5 minutes later and they had actually carried out their threats, then you'd take action? That's what you're telling me. That my wife had to actually be assaulted before the law would protect her? Daniels shifted uncomfortably. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that in a situation like this, with no witnesses and no evidence, it's hard to... There was a witness, a voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Martha Pruitt standing there, her arms crossed and her expression fierce. Behind her stood her husband, Tom, looking equally determined. Martha, Eleanor breathed, what are you doing here? Tom and I were riding our eastern boundary yesterday afternoon, Martha said, stepping into the office. We saw 3 men riding hard from the direction of the Warren Ranch. We thought it was strange, so we rode over to check on things. Found Eleanor and Caleb both looking shaken, and they told us what happened. That doesn't make you a witness to the actual threat, Daniels said, though he looked less confident now. No, but it corroborates their story, Tom Pruitt said. We saw 3 men leaving the Warren Ranch at speed. We saw the condition Eleanor was in, pale, scared, barely holding herself together. We saw the anger on Caleb's face. And we know Silas Reed has been making threats about getting even with Warren for years now. Put it all together, Sheriff, and you've got a clear pattern of harassment and intimidation. Furthermore, Martha added, Eleanor told me yesterday exactly what Reed said to her. Every word. I can testify to that if needed. And if you talk to anyone who knows Reed's character, they'll tell you he's more than capable of the behavior Eleanor described. Daniels looked between all of them, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he sighed. All right. I'll bring Reed in for questioning. I'll make it clear that any further approach to the Warren Ranch will result in arrest. But I'm warning you, Warren, Reed's not going to take kindly to this, and his friends won't either. I don't care about Reed's feelings, Caleb said flatly. I care about my wife's safety. You do your job, Sheriff, and make sure Reed understands there are consequences for threatening women. If you don't, I'll handle it myself. That sounds like a threat, Daniel said, narrowing his eyes. It's a promise, Caleb corrected. I will protect my wife by whatever means necessary. I'd prefer to do it within the law, but I will do it regardless. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment, and Eleanor could feel the tension crackling in the air. Finally, Daniels looked away first. I'll talk to Reed today, he said. Now get out of my office, all of you. Outside, Eleanor turned to Martha and Tom with gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you. You didn't have to come into town, didn't have to get involved in this. Of course we did, Martha said, pulling Eleanor into a brief hug. You're family now, and family protects each other. Besides, Tom added with a grim smile, Reed's been a thorn in the side of every decent rancher in this county for years. About time someone stood up to him officially. They talked for a few more minutes on the street, drawing curious stares from passers-by. Eleanor noticed the whispers, saw people pointing and talking behind their hands, but this time the nature of the gossip felt different. Word had already spread about the incident at the Warren Ranch, and people were reassessing their earlier judgments. We should visit the general store while we're here, Caleb said to Eleanor. Pick up those supplies we need. No point wasting the trip. The general store was run by a woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had the sharp eyes and sharper tongue typical of someone who made it her business to know everyone else's business. She looked up when Eleanor and Caleb entered, and her expression cycled through surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been respect. Mrs. Warren, she said, her tone noticeably warmer than it had been at the train station weeks ago. I heard about your trouble yesterday. Terrible thing, Men behaving that way. You must have been frightened half to death.
I was, Eleanor admitted, surprised by the woman's sympathy. But I managed. More than managed, from what I hear, Mrs. Henderson said. Stood them off with a rifle until your husband got back. That takes courage, especially for someone new to the territory. Eleanor's stronger than she looks, Caleb said quietly, his hand settling briefly on Eleanor's back in a gesture of support. As they selected their supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, fabric for new curtains Eleanor wanted to make, Mrs. Henderson kept up a steady stream of conversation. Eleanor gradually realized the woman was doing something deliberate. She was rewriting the narrative about Eleanor Warren in the minds of anyone who might be listening. A woman who can stand up to Silas Reed is a woman worth knowing, Mrs. Henderson declared as she wrapped their purchases. And Warren, you chose well when you married this one. Backbone and brains, that's a rare combination. Other customers had filtered into the store during their shopping, and Eleanor could see them listening, reassessing. The bargain bride label was being replaced with something else, something better. The woman who stood up to Reed, the woman with courage, the woman worth defending. As they left the store, supplies loaded on their horses, a man approached them on the street. He was older, weathered by sun and hard work, with kind eyes and a respectful demeanor. Mr. Warren? Mrs. Warren? He removed his hat. Name's Jacob Miller. I own the ranch south of yours. I heard about what happened yesterday, and I wanted you to know, if you ever need help, if you ever see trouble coming, you send word to me. I'll come running with every man I've got. That's very kind of you, Mr. Miller, Eleanor said, touched by the offer. Not kindness, ma'am, just decency. What Reed did, threatening a woman in her own home, that's not how we do things out here. Not if we're worth the land we claim. He looked at Caleb. You've kept to yourself since you took over your parents' ranch, Warren. Can't say I blame you after how some folks treated you, but there are good people in this county, too. People who believe in helping neighbors and protecting the innocent. Don't forget that. After Miller walked away, Caleb stood silent for a moment, staring after him. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I'd forgotten there were still people like that around here. Maybe you just needed a reason to remember, Eleanor said softly. They rode home in the afternoon light, and Eleanor felt the weight of the day beginning to lift. The sheriff would deal with Reed, at least officially. The town's opinion was shifting, becoming less hostile and more supportive, and she had Caleb beside her, solid and steady, a partner in every sense of the word. When they arrived at the ranch, Caleb helped her unload the supplies, then turned to her with an expression of determination. I meant what I said yesterday about teaching you to defend yourself. We should start now, while the light's still good. For the next 2 hours, Caleb taught Eleanor how to properly handle the rifle, how to load it, aim it, compensate for wind and distance, clean it, and most importantly, how to overcome the natural reluctance to actually pull the trigger. They set up targets in the field behind the barn, and Eleanor practiced until her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil and her ears rang from the reports. You're getting better, Caleb said encouragingly, after Eleanor managed to hit the target 3 times in a row. Natural talent, I'd say. Or desperation to never feel that helpless again, Eleanor said, reloading with increasing confidence. That too, Caleb agreed. But whatever the motivation, you're learning fast. Another few weeks of practice and you'll be able to defend this ranch as well as I can. As the sun began to set, they walked back to the house together, and Eleanor found herself studying Caleb's profile in the golden light. This man who had started as a stranger, who had offered her a marriage of convenience and necessity, had become something far more important. He was her defender, her teacher, her partner. And somewhere along the way, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, he had become her friend. That evening, as they prepared and shared dinner, the conversation flowed easily between them. Caleb told her stories about the ranch's history, about his parents and their struggles to build something lasting in this harsh land. Eleanor shared memories of her mother, carefully edited versions of her life in Philadelphia that focused on the good times before everything fell apart. Do you miss it? Caleb asked as they cleaned up after the meal. The city, the life you had before. Eleanor considered the question carefully. I miss my mother. I miss feeling safe and secure, though I realize now that security was always an illusion built on my father's promises and my mother's inheritance.
But the city itself, the society, the people, the constant performance of being someone I was supposed to be? She shook her head. No, I don't miss that at all. What do you think you'll miss about this life? Caleb asked. When you look back on it years from now. I think I'll miss the simplicity of this moment, Eleanor said honestly. The two of us in this kitchen, talking about our days, learning each other's stories, no pretense, no performance, just honesty. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling in the dishwater. I need to tell you something, he said finally. Something honest. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat at the seriousness in his tone. All right. When I sent for a mail order bride, I told myself it was practical, a business arrangement, a solution to problems that needed solving. He turned to face her, drying his hands on a towel. But watching you stand at that window yesterday, terrified but refusing to back down, seeing the courage it took for you to face those men, and then today, watching you stand in the sheriff's office and demand respect, watching you learn to shoot with the same determination you bring to everything else, he paused, seeming to search for words. Eleanor, this stopped being an arrangement for me somewhere along the way. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it did. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying? I'm saying that I care about you. Not as a business partner or a convenient solution to loneliness. I care about you as a person, as a woman I admire and respect and genuinely enjoy spending time with. He took a step closer. I'm saying that when Reed threatened you, I wasn't just defending my legal wife or protecting my property. I was defending someone He stopped, swallowed. Someone who has become incredibly important to me. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the tears of fear and humiliation she had shed before. These were tears of relief, of recognition, of something warm and wonderful unfurling in her chest. I care about you too, she said softly. I've been trying not to, trying to keep this practical and safe, but somewhere between your promises of respect and your defense of my dignity, between learning this ranch together and sitting on the porch in the evenings talking about everything and nothing, she smiled through her tears. I stopped being able to pretend this was just an arrangement. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and cupped her face in his calloused hands. Can I kiss you? Really kiss you, not the polite peck we shared at the wedding? Yes, Eleanor whispered. He lowered his head slowly, and when his lips met hers, it was nothing like the brief, respectful kiss they had shared in front of the Reverend. This was deep and genuine, full of all the feelings they had been carefully not acknowledging for weeks. Eleanor's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palms, and she poured into the kiss everything she had been afraid to say out loud. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I know we agreed to take things slow, he said quietly, and I still want to honor that. But I needed you to know that this is real for me now. You're real for me. Not an arrangement or a convenience. You're Eleanor, and you're priceless, and He took a shaky breath. I'm falling in love with you. Eleanor's tears spilled over, and she laughed shakily. I'm falling in love with you too, which is terrifying because I never expected this, never planned for it, and I don't entirely know what to do with these feelings. We figure it out together, Caleb said, echoing the promise he had made weeks ago. Same as we've figured out everything else. One day at a time, honest and careful and respectful. One day at a time, Eleanor agreed. They stood together in the kitchen, holding each other as the last light faded from the sky and the ranch settled into its evening quiet. The road that had brought them to this moment had been hard and humiliating, full of judgment and fear and circumstances neither of them would have chosen. But standing here now, Eleanor couldn't regret any of it, because that difficult road had led her to this place, this man, this unexpected love. That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed in her own room, still separate, still respecting boundaries, but now, with the knowledge that those boundaries might shift when they were both ready, she looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. This Eleanor was stronger than the frightened girl who had stepped off the train. This Eleanor had faced down armed men, had demanded respect from a skeptical sheriff,
had learned to shoot a rifle and manage account books and run a ranch. This Eleanor was falling in love with a good man who saw her value and defended her worth. The town had called her a bargain bride, had reduced her to a price tag. But Caleb had called her priceless, and Eleanor was beginning to understand what that meant. It meant she was beyond value, beyond measure. It meant she was chosen, not bought. It meant she was loved for who she was, not for what she cost. Through the wall, she could hear Caleb moving around in his own room, and she smiled at the domesticity of it. They were married, legally and socially. But the real marriage, the one built on trust and respect and genuine affection, was only just beginning. And Eleanor, who had once had no choices and no hope, now had both. She had chosen this life, this ranch, this man, and every day she would continue choosing them, building something real and lasting from the ashes of her old life. The bargain bride was gone. In her place stood Eleanor Warren, a woman of courage and dignity and worth that no one could diminish. And tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, she would continue proving to herself and the world exactly how priceless she truly was. The morning after their confession brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the ranch house. Eleanor woke earlier than usual, her heart lighter despite the lingering tension from recent events. When she emerged from her room, she found Caleb already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and breakfast started. He looked up when she entered, and the smile that crossed his face was open and warm in a way it hadn't been before. "Morning," he said, and there was something different in his voice too, a softness, an intimacy that acknowledged what had passed between them the night before. "Morning," Eleanor replied, moving to stand beside him at the stove. Their shoulders brushed, and neither of them pulled away. They worked together preparing breakfast, moving around each other with an easy familiarity that felt both new and ancient. When they sat down to eat, Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, holding it gently while they shared the meal. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the walls that had finally come down between them. "I've been thinking," Caleb said as he finished his coffee, "about what happens next. With Reed, with the town, with everything." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "What are your thoughts?" "Sheriff Daniels will talk to Reed, make it official that he needs to stay away. But Reed's the type to hold grudges, and men like that don't usually let things go just because the law tells them to." Caleb's expression grew serious. "I want to be prepared for the possibility that he might try something else. Different approach, maybe through his connections with Garrett Cole." "So what do we do?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. They would face it together, whatever came. "We build alliances. Jacob Miller offered help. We take him up on it. We strengthen our relationship with the Pruitts, with the other ranchers who are decent people. We make it clear that this ranch and this marriage aren't as isolated and vulnerable as Reed might think." He paused. "And we keep working on making you as capable of defending this place as I am. Not because I think you're weak, but because partnership means both of us being able to stand strong." "I can agree to that," Eleanor said, "though I reserve the right to still be learning. I've only been here a few weeks after all." "And look how far you've come in those few weeks," Caleb said, pride evident in his voice. "You've learned the ranch, mastered the account books, stood up to armed men, faced down a skeptical sheriff, and started learning to shoot. Most people take years to accomplish half of that." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise. "I had good motivation, and a good teacher." The next several weeks fell into a pattern that felt both productive and healing. Caleb continued Eleanor's shooting lessons, and she progressed from barely hitting the target to being able to group her shots with reasonable accuracy. They worked together on winterizing the ranch, repairing fences and buildings, ensuring the cattle had adequate shelter for the coming cold. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch when weather permitted, or by the fire when it didn't, talking about their days and their dreams, and slowly, carefully, building the foundation of something lasting. True to his word, Caleb began accepting help and offering it in return. Jacob Miller stopped by one afternoon with two of his sons, and together they repaired a section of barn roof that Caleb had been putting off. In exchange, Caleb helped Miller move his cattle to winter pasture. The Pruitts became regular visitors, with Martha teaching Eleanor more advanced cooking and preserving techniques, while Tom and Caleb discussed ranching strategies and shared resources. The town's attitude continued to shift as well. When Eleanor accompanied Caleb on supply runs to Bear Creek,
She noticed fewer hostile stares and more respectful nods. Mrs. Henderson at the general store always had a kind word and often set aside items she thought Eleanor might need. Even Sheriff Daniels, who had been skeptical during their initial report, stopped Caleb on the street one day to inform him that Reed had been officially warned and that any violation of that warning would result in immediate arrest. "Seems you've got people on your side after all, Warren," Daniels said grudgingly. "Miller's been talking you up to anyone who'll listen. Says you're a good neighbor, and your wife's got more spine than most men he knows." "Miller's a good judge of character," Caleb replied, his hand finding the small of Eleanor's back, "and he's right about my wife." But it wasn't all smooth progress. About 6 weeks after the incident with Reed, Eleanor was working in the garden one afternoon when she heard horses approaching. Her heart immediately kicked into high gear, and she reached for the rifle she now kept nearby whenever she was outside alone. But when she looked up, she recognized Garrett Cole's distinctive sorrel horse, and her anxiety crystallized into cold awareness. Cole rode up with 2 men Eleanor didn't recognize, all of them armed and looking official in a way that immediately set her on edge. She stood slowly, the rifle held casually but ready, and waited for them to state their business. "Mrs. Warren," Cole said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Your husband around?" "He's checking the north fence line," Eleanor said evenly. "Should be back within the hour. Can I help you with something?" "Actually, we're here on official business. I'm now serving as deputy to Sheriff Daniels, and these men are with me in that capacity." Cole's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We've had reports of cattle rustling in the area, and we need to inspect all the ranches to ensure brands are properly documented." Eleanor's mind raced. This was clearly a pretext, an excuse to get onto their property and poke around looking for some violation or weakness they could exploit. But refusing official business, even suspicious official business, would give Cole exactly the ammunition he wanted. "I see," she said carefully. "I'm sure my husband will want to be present for any inspection. If you'd like to wait for him to return, you're welcome to water your horses." "Oh, I don't think we need to wait," Cole said, dismounting. "This is official county business, Mrs. Warren. We have the authority to inspect with or without Warren present." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. "But as this is my home and my property, as much as my husband's, I'm telling you that you're welcome to wait for him or to come back at a more convenient time. I'm not denying you access. I'm simply requesting you show us the courtesy of conducting your business when both property owners are present." Cole's expression hardened. "You're in no position to make demands, Mrs. Warren. You're just a mail-order bride who—" "Who is the legal co-owner of this ranch?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharp. "Who has every right to determine when and how officials access her property, and who is increasingly tired of being dismissed by men who should know better." One of Cole's companions shifted uncomfortably, and Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. Cole himself looked like he'd bitten into something sour. "Fine," he said tersely. "We'll wait. But this isn't over, Mrs. Warren. There are rules and regulations that all ranches need to follow, and I intend to make sure your husband is following every single one of them." "I'm sure you'll find everything in perfect order," Eleanor said. "My husband is meticulous about documentation, as am I." She gestured toward the water trough, and the men led their horses over to drink. Eleanor remained where she was, rifle still in hand, watching them carefully. She could feel the tension radiating from Cole, could sense that this confrontation was about far more than cattle brands. It was about power, about putting her and Caleb in their place, about reminding them that Cole had influence in town and could make their lives difficult if he chose to. But Eleanor had learned something important in the weeks since arriving in Wyoming. She was not powerless. She had skills, she had allies, and she had the law on her side. Cole could posture and threaten all he wanted, but as long as she and Caleb maintained their integrity and their documentation, there was little he could actually do. When Caleb rode up 20 minutes later and saw Cole and his men waiting, his expression went cold and hard. He dismounted quickly and moved to Eleanor's side, his hand briefly touching her arm in silent question. She gave him a small nod. She was all right. Nothing had happened. "Cole," Caleb said flatly, "interesting to see you wearing a deputy's badge. When did Daniels lose his mind and give you authority?" "About a week ago," Cole replied. Town needs more law enforcement, and I volunteered my services. Now, about this inspection. What followed was a tedious hour of Cole and his men examining every piece of documentation Caleb and Eleanor could produce. Brand registrations, bills of sale, feed receipts, breeding records, all of it meticulously organized thanks to Eleanor's management of the accounts. Cole clearly wanted to find something wrong, some violation he could use against them, but there was nothing. Every document was in order, every regulation followed, every requirement met. Finally, clearly frustrated, Cole handed the papers back. Everything seems to be in order, for now. It'll be in order next time you check too, Caleb said, and the time after that. Because, unlike some people, we run this ranch honestly and by the book. Cole's eyes narrowed. You're making enemies, Warren. Powerful enemies. You'd be wise to reconsider some of your stubbornness. I'm not stubborn, Caleb said. I'm principled. There's a difference. And I'm not selling my land, not dividing my property, and not backing down from bullies just because they pin on a badge and pretend to have authority they abuse. For a moment, Eleanor thought Cole might actually take a swing at Caleb. The air crackled with tension, and Cole's hands clenched into fists. But then one of his companions cleared his throat meaningfully, and Cole seemed to remember himself. We'll be watching you, Cole said as he mounted his horse. Both of you, one mistake, one violation, and you'll have the law down on you so fast. Then I guess we won't make any mistakes, Eleanor said calmly. Good day, Deputy Cole. I'm sure you have other ranches to inspect. After they rode away, Caleb turned to Eleanor with a mixture of anger and admiration on his face. You handled that remarkably well. I was terrified the entire time, Eleanor admitted, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the confrontation was over. But I remembered what you said about not showing fear to men like that. And I remembered that we've done everything right, followed every rule. He has no real power over us. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her close. You're amazing. You know that? I'm learning to be, Eleanor said against his chest, with your help. That evening, as they sat together reviewing the day's events, Eleanor noticed something had shifted in her own mind. The fear that had plagued her since Reed's attack, the anxiety that had made her jumpy at every unexpected sound, had been tempered by today's confrontation. She had faced down Garrett Cole, a man with official authority and bad intentions, and she had won. Not through violence or intimidation, but through knowledge, preparation, and refusing to be diminished. I think I'm finally understanding what you meant, she said to Caleb as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. About being truly equal partners. What do you mean? Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders. I mean that partnership isn't just about dividing work or sharing decisions. It's about both people being strong enough to stand alone if they have to, but choosing to stand together because they're stronger that way. Eleanor turned to look at him. I could have handled Cole alone today if I'd needed to. I have the knowledge, the documentation, the authority, but having you there beside me made it easier, made it better. Same goes for me, Caleb said quietly. I could run this ranch alone. I did for years. But having you here, having someone who cares about this place as much as I do, who brings different skills and perspectives, who challenges me to be better, he smiled. It's not just easier. It's richer, fuller, more worthwhile. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. I love you, she said simply. I know we said we were falling in love, but I think I'm already there, completely, irrevocably. Caleb's arm tightened around her. I love you too. And I want you to know you have a choice here. Always. We're married legally, but the real marriage, the intimate part, that only happens when you're ready, when you want it. There's no pressure, no expectation. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she stood and held out her hand to him. Come inside with me. Caleb took her hand but didn't move. Eleanor. I'm ready, she said softly. Not because I feel obligated or pressured, but because I love you, and I trust you, and I want this marriage to be real in every sense. I'm choosing you, Caleb, fully, completely. The look on his face was everything, wonder and love and barely restrained desire, all tempered with the care and respect that had defined their relationship from the beginning. He stood slowly and followed her inside, And that night, in the quiet privacy of the ranch house they had built into a home, Eleanor and Caleb Warren became husband and wife in truth as well as law. Winter came to Wyoming with its characteristic harshness, but the Warren Ranch weathered it well. Eleanor and Caleb worked together to keep the cattle fed and safe, to maintain the buildings against snow and wind, to ensure they had enough supplies to last through the months when travel became difficult. The work was hard but satisfying, and they fell into rhythms that felt both natural and chosen. In late January, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. The discovery brought a mixture of joy and terror. Joy at the thought of bringing new life into the world, terror at the dangers of childbirth in such an isolated location. But Martha Pruitt, who had helped deliver half the babies in the county, assured her that everything would be fine. "You're strong and healthy," Martha said firmly when Eleanor confessed her fears. "And you've got a husband who'll move mountains to keep you safe. Plus you've got me, and I've brought more babies into this world than I can count. You'll do just fine, dear." When Eleanor told Caleb the news, she watched emotions play across his face in rapid succession: shock, joy, worry, and finally, a fierce protectiveness that made her heart swell. "We're going to be parents," he said wonderingly, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a family." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Caleb said. "Terrified, yes. Worried about all the things that could go wrong, absolutely. But happy? Eleanor, I'm so happy I can barely breathe." Spring arrived eventually, bringing new life to the ranch in more ways than one. The cattle produced healthy calves, the horses foaled successfully, and Eleanor's pregnancy progressed without complication. Her body changed and grew, and Caleb treated her like she was made of spun glass, which both touched and annoyed her. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him exasperatedly when he insisted on doing all the heavy lifting. "I'm perfectly capable of carrying a bucket of feed." "I know you are," Caleb said, "but humor me. Let me take care of you." The town's attitude had completed its transformation by this point. When word spread that Eleanor was expecting, the women of Bear Creek rallied around her in a way that would have seemed impossible during her first visit. They brought gifts of baby clothes and blankets, shared advice and remedies, and treated her like one of their own. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had been coldly judgmental at first, presented Eleanor with a beautiful hand-knitted baby blanket. "For the little one," she said warmly, "every baby deserves something made with love." In early August, on a day when the heat shimmered over the grasslands and the sky stretched endlessly blue, Eleanor went into labor. Caleb rode for Martha with a speed that bordered on reckless, and the older woman arrived prepared and confident. Tom came with her, and he took Caleb outside where the expectant father couldn't pace holes in the floor or drive the laboring mother to distraction with his worry. The labor was long and difficult, as first labors often are, but Eleanor drew on the same strength and determination that had gotten her through every other challenge Wyoming had thrown at her. When Martha finally placed a squalling, red-faced baby girl in her arms, Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of love and purpose. "She's perfect," Caleb breathed when he was finally allowed back inside. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, one finger gently touching his daughter's tiny hand. The baby immediately grasped it, and Caleb's expression melted into pure wonder. "She's absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Eleanor asked, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. Caleb looked at her with so much love it took her breath away. "I was thinking, Rose, after my mother, but only if you like it." "Rose Warren," Eleanor tested. "I love it. It's perfect." The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love, of learning to care for an infant while still running a ranch, of watching Caleb transform into a father who sang lullabies in his deep, quiet voice and walked the floor at 3 a.m. with Rose cradled against his broad chest. The ranch prospered under their joint management, and the community that had once viewed Eleanor with suspicion now counted her among their own. 1 year after Rose's birth, Eleanor stood on the porch of the ranch house holding her daughter, while Caleb worked with a new horse in the corral. The summer sun was warm on her face, and she could hear the sounds of the ranch all around her. Cattle lowing in the distance, chickens clucking near the coop, the rhythmic sound of Caleb's voice as he talked to the horse. This life, this place, this family. It was so far removed from anything Eleanor had imagined for herself back in Philadelphia. Then, she had been a desperate woman with no choices, accepting a marriage to a stranger because the alternative was destitution and despair. The town had called her a bargain bride, had reduced her worth to the price of a train ticket. But standing here now, with her daughter in her arms and her husband in sight, with a thriving ranch around her and a community that respected her, Eleanor understood the truth that Caleb had known from the beginning. She had never been a bargain. She had always been priceless. She had just needed the right circumstances, the right partnership, to recognize it in herself. "Mama, look," Rose said, pointing at Caleb with pudgy fingers. "Papa horse." "Yes, sweetheart," Eleanor said, smiling. "Papa's working with the horse." Caleb looked up and caught sight of them watching. His face broke into that smile Eleanor loved so much, the one that transformed his stern features and made him look young and unburdened. He waved, and Eleanor waved back, Rose squealing and waving her own hands enthusiastically. Martha Pruitt rode up a few minutes later, followed by Jacob Miller and his wife Sarah, who had become close friends with Eleanor over the past year. They were coming for dinner, a regular occurrence now that the Warrens had become central members of the community. "Look at you," Martha said warmly, dismounting and coming to take Rose from Eleanor's arms. "Standing on your porch like the lady of the manor with your beautiful daughter and your successful ranch." "Far cry from the scared girl who got off the train 2 years ago, isn't it?" Eleanor said, though she said it with fondness rather than bitterness. "That scared girl had more courage than she knew," Sarah Miller said. "Coming all this way alone, facing down a town full of judgment, standing up to men like Silas Reed, you were always strong, Eleanor. You just needed the chance to prove it." Caleb finished with the horse and joined them on the porch, sliding his arm around Eleanor's waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "Everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," Eleanor said, leaning into him. And it was. Not because life on a Wyoming ranch was easy. It wasn't. Not because they never faced challenges or conflicts. They did. But because Eleanor and Caleb had built something real and lasting on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine partnership, and hard-earned love. They had taken a marriage that started as transaction and transformed it into something precious beyond measure. That evening, after their friends had gone home and Rose was asleep in her cradle, Eleanor and Caleb sat together on the porch in the gathering twilight. The ranch stretched out before them, peaceful and prosperous, the result of their combined efforts and unwavering commitment. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked quietly. "Coming here, marrying me, choosing this life?" Eleanor turned to look at him, this man who had offered her dignity when she had nothing, who had defended her worth when others sought to diminish it, who had loved her patiently and thoroughly until she learned to love herself as much as he loved her. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This life, this ranch, this family. It's everything I never knew I wanted, everything I didn't know I deserved." "You deserved it all along," Caleb said. "You were always worthy of respect and love and partnership, always priceless, even when people tried to convince you otherwise." Eleanor smiled, thinking of how far they had both come. Caleb, who had been isolated and lonely, now had a wife and daughter and a network of friends and allies. Eleanor, who had been desperate and diminished, now had confidence and capability and a place she truly belonged. "We saved each other," she said softly, "in all the ways that matter." "Yes," Caleb agreed, pulling her closer. "We did." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky and the Wyoming night settled around them, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace and rightness. The journey that had brought her here had been hard and humbling, full of judgment and fear, but it had led her to this moment, this place, this love that was fully claimed, fully resolved, and entirely their own. The town had called her a bargain bride, cheap and disposable, but Caleb Warren had known better. He had seen her true value from the beginning, had recognized the strength and courage beneath the desperation, and together they had built a life that proved beyond any doubt that what they found in each other was beyond price, beyond measure, beyond anything that could be bought or sold. They were partners. They were lovers. They were family. And they were priceless, both of them, in all the ways that truly mattered. As Eleanor sat on the porch of the ranch she had helped build, watching the stars emerge over the Wyoming grassland, holding the hand of the man who had shown her what true partnership meant, she thought about the girl who had stepped off that train 2 years ago, scared, alone, and convinced she had been reduced to the cost of a ticket. That girl would have been amazed to see what she became, would have been astonished by the strength she found, the love she built, the life she created from nothing but determination and the willingness to believe in possibilities. Eleanor Warren was no one's bargain. She was no one's possession. She was a woman of worth and dignity, a partner in an equal marriage, a mother, a rancher, a friend, a valued member of her community. She was all of these things because she had chosen to be, because she had the courage to believe she deserved them, and because she had found a partner who saw her value even when she couldn't see it herself. The whispers were long gone. The judgment had faded. In their place was respect, admiration, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and hard won. Eleanor Warren was priceless, and she had finally learned to believe it.